I think my understanding of 1981 riots, simply because I wasn't born at the time, largely comes from working with the collection at the Black Cultural Archives. I previously used to work at the Black Cultural Archives, and that was a collection that I was developing at the time. So I worked in the oral histories, and I've worked around the riots that happened in 1981. And I think from that, the fundamental theme that came out of that was policing, particularly racism in policing. If I'm going to cut slightly to 2011, I worked for The Guardian, and we did a piece of research with the London School of Economics into the riots across across the entire nation. And we looked, I didn't say we looked specifically at Brixton, but we did speak to people from the area who participated in that. And I think that was more varied. There was themes about policing, but there was themes about general inequality or perceptions of inequality and injustice that existed between the state, your elites, politicians, big business, and your ordinary person, your ordinary young person. A feeling that, there was an anger that caught fire previously in Tottenham, and so it almost felt like there was some kind of, some kind of wave that people felt, well, let's go and express ourselves too. Let's go continue what we saw happen in Tottenham. And there was a sense that people felt that they could basically feel empowered to go out into the streets. And depending on your perspective of how you feel power should be executed, whether destroying your own community constitutes real empowerment is another thing. But from the people that we spoke to in the interviews that were conducted, people feeling, first of all, disempowered by the status quo, felt that time brought the opportunity to actually go out and feel empowered and basically take their own back against the state and everybody who that embodied. What was the role of young people during the riots? I think the danger of focusing on young people in the riots is that you isolated just the young people. Of course, we know that there was a broad spectrum of people involved. And furthermore, I think a lot of the people who did get involved, I think that they were from communities who've had specific issues with the police, which means that if you focus on youth, you miss the connection with the elders. So many people who were out on the streets, their family were out on the streets in 1980. I remember one specific case in Liverpool where people said, my mum told me about being a part of Toxteth riots. I wanted to be a part of these riots. My family have been heralded by the police continually. I remember one of the first people to be arrested in Tottenham, his mother was a very famous case of police brutality. And so there is actually a community link there. And if you focus just on the youth, you might miss that. Of course, young people were disproportionately involved. And a large part of the feedback that I've heard is largely due to the fact that many of the people involved felt over-policed. And of course, I think personally, my opinion is that young people are in an interesting space where in this current climate, I don't think you've seen greater assaults on what young people have, opportunities, employment. And I feel that in amongst being, young and not really having maybe particular responsibilities, people felt that, we're angry and we can express ourselves because we've got nothing else to lose. But I guess that's a good question for somebody younger than myself, maybe such as yourself. I think everybody's always looking for somebody to blame, regardless of what happens. I think it's a dangerous perspective, always looking to blame. It's better to look for an explanation rather than to look for somebody to blame per se. And with something like the riot, which there was such a broad number of causes, generic causes, from your unemployment, from your police brutality, from your police injustice, from the fact that there's grave inequalities, which are obviously mass generic themes, to your more, I would say, personalized issues. The fact that, depending on who you spoke to, everybody might have a different reason for being out there. I think life can be very hard. And I think at times people can feel isolated. And when you see a wave where you get to almost feel empowered and get a crazy rush or a buzz from being a part of such a move, that might fuel you. And so now you're talking about alienation. You might even go deeper into it and find out that particular people, had very, 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 I would say, personal issues. And so looking for one specific issue to blame, I think we miss so many things. I think what we can do, though, is we can say, well, let's look at the things that were consistent. And I definitely believe that inequality is something that is huge. I definitely think that police impunity is something that is huge across the board. And I think these are some of the areas that I would look at and say, well, hang on, why is it that our state, or certainly the way that certain communities and certain people relate to the state, why has it led them to feel like the only way that they can make a protest or make a stand or even feel a sense of power is by taking to the streets in violence? Because that says that perhaps our politics is broken. If I knew what could be done to prevent riots from happening, I might be a rich man. But looking at it solely from what I've researched, if I'm going to just take a very simplistic view of it and not so much engage with the inequality aspect, which was huge, and not so much engage with the backlash against the elites, and I'm talking about expenses, I'm talking about, the bankers, which got a lot of people very irate, the fact that they were treated differently. And they mentioned that in research. If I say, well, actually, looking back at what happened, a man was shot there by the police. It was leaked that he fired at the police first. Nobody believed it. The family didn't have any communication with the police, so they then marched upon the station, and those channels weren't open. I would say, well, clearly, if there were clear channels where the police actually engaged with the family, there would have been no march. And if there's no march, there's no protest in Tottenham, there's no riot in Tottenham, there's no wave. And then you could also say, well, if people actually had trust in the police, they wouldn't need to protest in that manner for answers, because they trust them, they'll trust the processes. If they trusted that actually the police do not get away with shooting somebody, or they cannot get away with over-policing or acts of racism, as we've seen in The Guardian, if people felt that the systems were actually trustworthy and that they worked, perhaps people wouldn't take to the streets in the way that they did. And so I think I'd say, if I had to, I'd say that if people trusted the state to be fair and to be just, you're less likely to see riots. With the 1980 riots, my familiarity comes through working with the collection at the BCA and developing that collection. And developing collections slightly different from maybe, pure primary or secondary research in that sense. I would say that I'm an informal researcher in that sense, because obviously I'm going through the collection, I'm engaging with it. But because I'm not actually putting out published material, you can't really call me a researcher into the 1980 riots, even though I would say I know quite a bit about it myself. My thoughts of it is simply that the 1980s were a time of real division, real conflict, real inequality. I'm tempted to draw academic parallels between what is happening then and what is happening now. I see clear similarities, but I didn't live in the 1980s then. And certainly hearing the stories, even in the archive, from Alex Wheatle, from family, from friends, I see that as being a slightly different experience, even though many of the things that happened then are happening now. The 1980 riots, I think, clearly backlash against racism, clearly a backlash against inequality, factorism, the fact that, police had impunity and they were given that level of impunity. I think we've seen from Leveson, we've seen from Macpherson, we've seen from, let's say from Scarman, but it's kind of hinted in Scarman, the fact that at that time, the elites, the establishment, the police, they were really in cahoots. And in terms of youths from Brixton, from Tottenham, from Derry in Ireland, they were really seen as the enemy. And they were openly attacked. And they were openly given license to attack them, because they were seen as, they were seen almost an enemy within. And I think even if you draw some of the famous speeches, Thatcher saying that we feel swamped by these, Caribbean migrants and Asian migrants that have come into the country, and the fact that Enoch Powell's speech earlier talking about rivers of blood, and that was almost seen as a definitive text by some of the far-right groups that would come into communities, and many of the far-right, had infiltrated the police. I remember there's a famous segment on somebody recalling their time as a police officer in the 1980s, saying, I wasn't a racist when I joined the police force, but by the time I left, I was definitely a racist. And I think, the 1980s was a really volatile and violent and unequal time. And so for me, the the riots of that time were pretty much an expression of that. Okay. The spark that caused the riots, without doubt, I think was Mark Duggan's shooting. I don't think Mark Duggan's shooting was isolated. I think in that past year, I've been on numerous marches where people were actually making cases against deaths in custody. There were so many high-profile deaths in custody. Even if you look back at what happened to Jody McIntyre when he got pulled out of his wheelchair, and there was a whole movement called Bars for Change that basically wrote and produced music about police violence and police impunity. And then Mark Duggan was shot, and everybody was said that he shot first, and nobody in Tottenham believed it for a second. And then that was the fact that was a spark that led to people basically protesting, and that broke into riots in Tottenham. And I think that most people recognize Mark Duggan's death as being a spark. What I would say was the fuel was the broad other social context, and that was obviously, or the political context, which is, in 2011, there had never been a greater sense of unfairness and a free-for-all. You're seeing the police come under great scrutiny in terms of Leveson and all kind of things that came to the surface. You're seeing expenses claims, you're seeing bangers, bonuses. There was a lot of anger against the state, not even just in terms of people that participate, but their communities themselves. And that's something that we found. You're also seeing the fact that, unemployment's rising. There is a sense that things just aren't fair and things are not accessible. And you've got this huge context happening in Britain of crisis. You've got this huge sense that there is crisis happening. And then you've got the anger. And I think those two almost create a perfect storm. Now, if I'm going to talk about the oxygen, which kind of is a way of kind of like a fuel in a sense, I think the media, and obviously that I work as media, so that's a bit of a concession in itself. But I think the images that were going around, and the headlines that the police can't do anything, the streets have got the power. The various 24-hour news, I think the various headlines, I think that really led people to go out and see, well, hang on, is this true? And I think media storms are huge. I don't know why, I don't think there is anybody that can really explain the relationship between activity and media coverage. But for me, I do feel that media coverage can inadvertently fuel things happening as well. That isn't to say that you shouldn't cover it. It's just almost like something that happens. And I think what was interesting was that people would say, I saw it on TV, and I couldn't believe what they were saying. So I had to go down and see it for myself, and and so forth. Obviously, there are other things as well. People talk about social media, or not social media so much, more BBM. And I know BBM was a big thing. But for me, I would look at Mark Duggan's death as a spark. I'll consider the sense of crisis maybe as the fuel, and then the oxygen, I think, was media. If I was to put a 3-point manifesto, very simple and very basic, on how to prevent riots, because obviously, it's pretty difficult. I would say 1, build institutions that people trust. If people feel that the law works in their favor, they don't need to protest against it. People feel that police works in their interest, they don't need to protest against it because they have faith that the system works. And a riot really is a breakdown in politics, and that's what happened. It was a breakdown in the way that the community rated to the police because of a huge incident that happened. Second thing, I think that people need to feel that not just the state is fair, that society is fair. And I think that if people feel that there are grave inequalities that they cannot overcome, then that thinks, well, why should I consent to be a part of the rules? If we think about the whole conception of a state, a democracy, the way that it's conceived is that people go and vote, and when they vote, they give up their power to go and rob a man, to go and thief something. They give up that power and they say, well, you know what, we're going to comply and we're going to give this government the power to make laws in our interest, because that way we'll all be better off. We're better off, aren't we, if we say we're not going to rob, we're not going to steal, it's not going to be anarchic. We're better off this way if we have these rules that govern and we're all, governed by them. It's equality in that sense. But if people feel, well, actually, these laws are put in place to benefit some over others, why should I comply? Why is it in my interest? Why would I not get involved in crime? Why would I not get involved in, in being opposed to the system. If people don't think it's fair, why would they? Now, clearly, people feeling that society is fair is really important. In that sense, a level of equality in society is, talking about social mobility, social inclusion. That's very relevant. You simply cannot have large groups of people from one particular area, be it Liverpool, being dramatically unemployed, having lower prospects than any other place in the country. Or you cannot have, young black males dramatically unemployed in compared to white males. You simply cannot have that. If you have these grave inequalities, they're going to kick off, no matter where they are. Be it they're in Salford, where you have probably majority working class white males who are disproportionately unemployed, or you have it in places like Tottenham. And then it comes back to, for me, the final one, which is probably maybe a softer point. I think, and this is a bit more, utopian. People, I think, are less likely to riot if they're happy. So whatever increases happiness, you'd assume is less likely to have people angry and take to the streets. And how do you increase happiness? I don't know. For me, I'm going to increase my happiness by going to Bambula and getting something to eat later. So those would be my 3 points. I don't know if there's any differences. Research will say that they were different. Research will say that there was a clearer narrative in the 1980s. Britain was racist, Britain was unfair, police were violent, people backlashed against it. And they will say 2011 was far more convoluted, it was far more diverse, it was more complex, they'll say. I think some of the root issues very much were prevalent in 2011, and also I'm someone who draws a lineage between the two, and I say, well, hang on, what we see is it's the same communities from 1980s who are again involved in 2011. Like I mentioned previously, one of the first people to be arrested in Tottenham, his mother died in a famous case of police brutality. These are people who had a very long experience of the police, if not them personally, but certainly their families. So that history is very relevant. People say, again, 2011, there was far more violence and less protests. So there was more looting in that sense. But then people forget, Brixton, there was crazy looting happening in Brixton. Somebody I know who was involved said to me, I remember being chased by the police, and in one hand I had a little portable TV, and in another hand I had a stereo. And I'd been chased by the police, and it really hurt me, but I had to let one of them go, and I didn't know which one to let go. So I had to let go of the television because I love music, and then I got away. And they were telling me about the opportunism in the leather jacket stores and things like that. And so I know that looting was a part of the 1980 riots. I know that for a fact. But of course, the way that history is then retold, it's told in a way to take away the politics. So that was real, this isn't real. That way you don't have to deal with the issues. But in terms of giving you a conclusive answer as to what were the fundamental differences, I think more research needs to be done in that sense.